and mutual respect across genders, ages and cultures in its work. So 3 witnesses today, and I would first like to invite Mr. Tom Andrews, indeed, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, to give his statement to us. So, Mr. Andrews, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be joining all of you here today. I want to thank you all for the leadership that you are demonstrating in holding these series of hearings and making clear what I should be clear to just about everybody, certainly to the people of Myanmar, that the international community has failed the people of Myanmar, and much, much more needs to be done. Last fall, I asked the UN General Assembly to do a critical assessment of the response of the international community to this crisis with recommendations on how it can improve. And I'm so happy that you, APHR, have decided to take this task on. It is a critically important one. I've served as a member of a parliamentary body for a dozen years, so I can empathize with the responsibility that you have and the opportunity that you have. I've also had the pleasure of working with APHR members on the crisis in Myanmar. We took a trip some years ago into Myanmar to examine some of the human rights issues there. So it's wonderful to be asked to join you today as the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. I think everybody on this panel, in this hearing, understands that conditions in Myanmar have gone from bad to worse, and they continue to go downward. This is a crisis that is deepening with every passing day. I think it's also fair to say that the people of Myanmar, at least those who I have been speaking with overwhelmingly, are disappointed by the international community and the failure of the international community to come to their aid. And let me make it very clear that the people of Myanmar are leading the way out of this mess. They have shown extraordinary courage, tenacity in their attempts to save their country. In fact, sanctions, I know that we're going to be talking a bit about sanctions today, have been imposed first and foremost by the people of Myanmar themselves. They have withdrawn their payment of their taxes. They have withdrawn paying their energy bills because it goes to the junta. They are boycotting anything and everything that can enrich the resources that are going, enrich the coffers of the junta and stop the resources from flowing into the junta. That is precisely what we as an international community need to be doing. We need to answer their call, follow their leadership, and do what they are doing, namely stopping the empowerment and the enabling of the junta from continuing on its atrocities. The key missing ingredient, it seems to me, from the point of view of the international community, is the failure of political will. We need the political will to act. And if you want to know what the political will looks like when it exists to take action, just take a look at what's happening in Ukraine. And the fact that in an extraordinarily short period of time, in 4 days, since the invasion of Ukraine, the Security Council met to consider a resolution. A special session of the General Assembly was established. Sanctions against those responsible for the attacks were immediately established by key member states of the United Nations. They included sanctions against financial institutions, the cutting off of some banks, the elimination of the international banking messaging system, the sanctioning of Russia's central bank, the freezing of foreign currency reserves. So a very comprehensive set of actions was taken in a very, very short period of time. In contrast, in 17 months, since the junta has launched its brutal attack against the people of Myanmar, there has been no Security Council convening to consider a resolution. There has been no emergency special session of the General Assembly. There have been no targeting of Myanmar military's access to the international banking systems. no sanctions against the Myanmar financial institutions like the Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank, no freezing of the Myanmar Central Bank assets except by the United States. There's been no mobilizing of a multinational task force to identify, hunt down, and freeze assets of the military junta and its cronies. And there has been no such task force, such as we have seen in response to the crisis in Myanmar. I believe that there should be a call for an immediate convening of the Security Council. The Security Council should consider a resolution to establish targeted sanctions, a weapons ban, as well as reference to the International Criminal Court. Now, everyone says to me, well, listen, of course we know that such a resolution will go nowhere. It will be vetoed. Well, that's exactly what happened in the case of Ukraine, but it was put before the Security Council anyway. And there was a full debate and vote, a full airing, and nations had to stand up and be counted when it came to taking and casting a vote on that resolution. That exposed the public to what was going on, focused political attention, and I think it would be very, very important to do in this case. Short of that, once that process has been completed, I believe what is necessary is the convening of an international summit of nations who are willing to take action, so that together, as nations who are willing to stand up and impose what the people of Myanmar are asking us to do, imposing targeted sanctions, weapons ban, coordinated action to impose the maximum pressure on the military junta and cut off the flows of resources that are enabling, aiding and abetting its systematic murder of the people of Myanmar. I would call for that kind of a public focused summit, draw the people's attention of the world, and from that summit, establish coordinated actions, establishing these targets.
Mr. Andrews, I think your microphone just got shut. Okay, thank you. Now you're on again. Yeah, thanks.
I apologize. It may be my computer saying you're not making a lot of sense, so I'm going to cut you off.
I doubt.
Hopefully not. What I'm saying, and I'll end with this, and there's lots of specifics that we can get into. And by the way, I'm very happy to provide you with additional information and resources. I know that time is short. There's some very important people who are willing to and are here to testify with you as well. But I think what is important is that there be a coordinated, focused, targeted approach by the international community. There exists right now a variety of sanctions and actions that have been taken by different nations, but those actions are not coordinated. There's not a strategy. There's not a focus. What has to happen is an analysis of what are the targets that will yield us the greatest results. What are the junta's strongest vulnerabilities? And then we target coordinated action toward those specific areas that we think will have the greatest effect. And then we monitor and process that on an ongoing basis when it comes to weapons, when it comes to freezing of assets, when it comes to sanctions that can stop the flow of revenue coming into the coffers of the junta. And I believe it could be best achieved, and the goal of establishing the political will that is necessary to do this by convening an international summit of those nations who are willing to take that action. And through that summit, establish greater public awareness, greater political will, and a focused, coordinated strategy of action. And with that, I will end my opening remarks, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your very clear and concrete statement on what needs to be done by the international community. And I thank you also giving us the picture of the contrast between how the international community has reacted to the Ukraine crisis, the unprovoked aggression by Russia against Ukraine. So indeed, I think it's shameful to see that nothing of the kind of international response has been possible with Myanmar so far. So I think you have just given us a very good suggestions on what our parliamentary inquiry can also promote. So my first question to you before opening the floor to the other colleagues is that you talk about willing nations in a way, those nations that would want to convene such an international summit. So I would like to hear a little bit from you, your suggestions, what we could think of, and then you also mentioned that the UN Security Council should be convened with the aim of having a resolution with targeted sanctions, weapons ban, and referral to the ICC. So again, what would be a way to get such a UN Security Council meeting convened? So I start with this, and then I open the floor to other colleagues. So please, Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, it means approaching the members of the Security Council and saying that this is something that needs to happen. And in my view, there's value even in with the prospect of an inevitable veto. It is an exercise that is worth taking. I think the people of Myanmar deserve that open debate and a full accounting by member states as to where they stand with respect to the international community doing much more than it has. And this is something that people of Myanmar who I have spoken to have repeatedly called upon the world to do. That would be then the step that would follow that, immediately follow that, assuming that there is a veto, and I think we can assume that will be the case. Then there's the announcement of those nations who are willing to stand with and for Myanmar will do so in a coordinated manner. There are 41 nations who have some form of economic pressure that has been established against the junta. It comes in a variety of ways. Asset freezes, there have been travel bans, there have been sanctions on military holding companies, there have been sanctions on state-owned entities. The EU and the US, for example, have sanctioned the Myanmar Timber Enterprise, the Myanmar Gems Enterprise, the Myanmar Pearl Enterprise. And this is an important step forward. Various countries, including South Korea, many Western countries who I've just mentioned, the US, EU, Canada, have suspended development assistance to Myanmar. Many have an arms embargo. These are all important steps that have been taken. The EU has established sanctions on Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. Again, a very important step forward, but there is no coordination. These are kind of a hodgepodge, if you will, of sanctions and activities by different countries, but they don't add up to a coherent, effective whole. And so what I'm calling for, and there's a range of options here, we can debate, what are the most effective, least effective, and that debate can occur in a summit of nations in which this is put in place. Finally, let me just say this, Madam Chair. It would also provide a mechanism for the enforcement of sanctions mechanisms. There's now evidence to show that despite some of the sanctions that have been put into place on Myanmar state-owned enterprises like the Timber Enterprise, MTE, there's evidence that teak is being sold in countries, the very countries that are imposing these sanctions. So we need to follow these leads, establish strong coordinated enforcement, and do this in a very targeted way. There are mechanisms in most countries that specifically target and analyze and research these asset flows, the flows of resources and the banking institutions. We need to put these assets to work together in a coordinated fashion. So coordinated enforcement, coordinated research, and coordinated sanctions and asset freezes, as well as weapons bans, are all a key ingredient, or all key ingredients to what I think is important, but only if done in a focused, targeted, coordinated manner.
Thank you. I'd like to add an additional question before referring to colleagues. You have mentioned in the UN Human Rights Council lately that some of the entities which fuel atrocities have not been touched. And you have mentioned the Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank and MOGE. You also, however, mentioned that the EU has now put sanctions against MOGE, the national oil and gas company. Could you perhaps continue the list a little bit? Which would still have to be in the focus of further sanctions. And thank you for being so clear on the need to coordinate the sanctions. And a good reminder that 41 nations, as you have said, have some kind of countermeasures against the junta, which is a remarkable number of countries. But so where are the entities that fuel atrocities that still would need to be targeted?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think what would be useful is to think about this as, okay, as if a criminal enterprise had just taken over the assets, the bank accounts of someone, of an entity, and are now stealing those assets that belong to the people who truly own those assets, and are using it to attack the people of the country. This is exactly what is happening with respect to Myanmar. The junta has stolen the assets that belong to the people of Myanmar, the natural resources, the currency. This is a theft that is happening before our very eyes. And so we need to have a police action that is going to stop that theft. So the Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank is one of the examples that has been identified as a very important target where assets should be frozen. You mentioned, Madam Chair, that the EU has established, targeted the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, very important. The mining enterprises, number 1 and 2, are targets that should be considered. Myanmar timber enterprise, another example. And these are examples of some entities, not all, but some have some form of action has been taken by some countries. The United States has frozen $1 billion worth of assets of the junta. Very effective step that can be taken. But these are not, again, being done in a systematic or coordinated way. We need to add up what's the most effective targets. And there are many, Madam Chair, and I'm happy to share additional ones with you as you prepare your report. But these are examples of some of the largest assets that could be targeted and that I think should be targeted.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I refer now to Charles Santiago to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Tom, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Charles.
In your earlier presentation, you talked about political will. And in the initial stages of the coup d'etat in Myanmar, you find almost every country jumping up and down, asking for democracy to be put back and so on and so forth. But finally, it kind of petered down. And every country from China to Russia to the United States to Europe all pointed to ASEAN. We'll all follow ASEAN. In fact, all the resolutions in all of these countries essentially said we will take the ASEAN's lead in dealing with Myanmar. But now we are already a year and a half into the coup d'etat. And number 2, the 5-point consensus put forward by ASEAN is almost same time, about a year and a half now, but it has gone nowhere, absolutely nowhere. And the most recent visit of the special envoy from Cambodia to Myanmar also, he had just met Min Aung Hlaing, he met the foreign minister, and then he met representatives of pro-government political parties, but not the NLD or other groups, independent groups that are fighting for independence, democracy, and so on and so forth. So the point basically is that the ASEAN 5-point consensus has come to a knot, really a knot. And then in another 3 months' time, which will be August, September, and November, September, October, November, there will be a new chair. It will be Indonesia. So we have got 2 years that has bypassed us. And my biggest fear is that next year there will be an election in Myanmar, and the junta is preparing for it already, as I understand. They will have an elections, and they will then appoint themselves to become the legitimate representatives of the people of Myanmar. This is a sketch. But I want to go back to the issue of political will. ASEAN doesn't have the political will. Europe does not have the political will. America, you just name it, none of them have the political will. So where are we in the entire process? The only people who have the political will are the civil society and the people of Myanmar. As you correctly point out, the people of Myanmar are fighting, and we have to go to the UN Security Council, even if it doesn't work for the sake of the people of Myanmar. So I'm just actually at a loss in terms of understanding at the international level. In my view, there is no political will, and you correctly point out, compare that with Ukraine. It's a different game altogether. Ukraine was very interesting. I think it's a CNN reporter who said those refugees look like us. That tells you a lot, though. Talking about being white and so on and so forth. And of course, Myanmaris don't look white. Light skin, but not white and tall enough, and no blue eyes and so on and so forth. So the point is there is no political will even in ASEAN. ASEAN too is fragmented. I think, and as you correctly point out in your visit to Malaysia, Mrs. Foreign Minister has been quite open, quite forefront, has actually helped to push forward a certain kind of approach in managing Myanmar, but nobody else. So I'm just thinking, I mean, we are in a situation where nothing is giving in. There's no giving here. So I'm just trying to understand, what else can we do? I'm agree with you. Go to the Security Council is fine, but I want to play devil's advocate, though. I mean, what can really come out of the Security Council decision? It'll be a nice meeting. You have nice publicity, but then it's not going to reflect on anything that's happening in Myanmar. Especially you're going to shake the establishment. What is it that we have to do to shake the establishment, which something we have not done so far? I'm just, throwing some ideas. I'll get your views on this.
Yeah, thanks. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Charles. And I think many people share your frustration. And my call for the Security Council to consider a resolution, a strong resolution. First of all, it's their job. This is why they exist. And so it seems to me that they should first and foremost do their job. And even if there's a veto, at least there's a public hearing. And then there is the launch to an emergency special session of the General Assembly, as what happened in Ukraine. And then those countries who are willing to take coordinated action can do so. With respect to ASEAN, you're right, there's a 5-point consensus. What's happened is that the junta, Min Aung Hlaing in particular, uses every opportunity that he can to try to manipulate and create an image of legitimacy. So, he flies to Jakarta, he comes back, he's engaging with the heads of state of ASEAN, and he projects at home that things are getting back to normal. And he is going to be working with the international community and ASEAN in moving forward. So first of all, it's important to know that he will, and the junta will, use any scrap of international action that it can to try to project the false image of legitimacy. And you put your finger right on this. Perfect example is their discussion of the election, quote unquote, in 2023. There is no possible way that there can be a free and fair election in Myanmar, even close under current circumstances. You cannot have a free and fair election if you lock up the leaders of the opposition. You can't have a free and fair election if you put some of them on death row and announce to the world that you're about to execute them. None of these conditions exist. Now, the danger here would be if any nation, wittingly or unwittingly, were to support this ruse by engaging in any way with such an election observation, consultation, any step that is taken by any nation that could be seen and perceived as legitimizing the junta and this election. Believe me, the junta is going to use that to the maximum degree possible. So we need to make sure, in my view, that nations do not fall into that trap and support this effort on the part of the junta to give this ruse of legitimacy. I think it's very useful when it comes to the 5-point consensus that you have leadership now emerging in ASEAN, starting with the foreign minister of Malaysia, who I know testified in your last hearing. He has said publicly, look, there's no movement. And the longer there's no movement, the more people are going to die in Myanmar. So his push for an action plan, his push for a time frame connected to that action plan is extremely important. It's kind of, we now see traction within ASEAN in its approach to an alternative approach to the crisis in Myanmar. I think we need to seize that. And if it can't be done with all the nations of ASEAN, then perhaps it can with some of the nations of ASEAN, that some steps can be taken, and then the nations of the world can then link up with those actions in a coordinated manner. But I'll tell you, Charles, there's no greater expression of the frustration that you have reflected than my conversations with the people in Myanmar, including those who have lost family members who have just suffered greatly and are asking me, where is the world? Where are you when we need you? We don't need more expressions of concern or deep concern. We need action. And that is a call that I think all of us need to heed. And if it can't be the entire world, if it can't be the entire Security Council, if it can't be the entire membership of ASEAN, then we need to seize those who are willing to take that action, support them, and move it forward in a coordinated manner.
Madam Chair, can I follow up with a question?
Sure. Yes, please do.
Thanks, Chair. Tom, coming back to the elections, clearly these elections that will take place in next year, and something they've already spoken about, the junta has already spoken about when elections in 2023. Should we then start a campaign, a global international campaign, to say that this election cannot go on and the international community, including ASEAN, will not support it? And maybe that's a call that we need to do beginning now, and call the elections as a farce, as an illegitimate process, and therefore the global community will not accept it. Because before even they start doing it, we already say we're not going to accept it. So that means ASEAN, meaning the ASEAN countries here, when they meet in the next 2 months, must make it clear to Myanmar, no elections next year, we're not going to accept it. And the international community, including the UN Security Council, should actually say the same thing. So if there was going to be a UN Security Council, then that should be one of the issues that should be spoken about at the council, where there's no election next year. It'll be interesting to see what China and Russia do at that meeting. Are they going to veto that as well? That's point number one. Point number two, Madam Chair, we can respond to it, Tom, in a short while, but I'm going to say something else before the other members come on board, though, is the issue of humanitarian aid. At this time, as your report points out, I think your recent report 3 weeks ago, this crime against humanity, against women and children in the border areas of Thailand, I think this is very serious. It's not only a Myanmar problem, it has also become an ASEAN problem, where refugees are moving to other parts of ASEAN, Thailand, Malaysia included. Now, that issue is really the demand for food, demand for medicine, and so on and so forth is absolutely urgent. Is there something that can be done in the next couple of months in order to ensure that attention is brought there, that the situation in the border areas is far worse than in other countries at war and so on and so forth? I don't want to say Ukraine at this time because it's also bad there, but the point basically is that it is devastating. no food, people are dying, children are being bombed. It's a massacre. It's a massacre that's happening in front of us, and we are just happily watching it. So what can we do to at least get attention from the international community to at least get the ties to open up the border so that the people at the border, which is running into millions, can have access to some kind of food, support, healthcare, basic stuff?
Well, Charles, you're exactly right. It is a humanitarian disaster ongoing in Myanmar right now. Over half the country has fallen into poverty. 33,000 people are going to die this year, unnecessary deaths, only because they have not received their inoculation. These are mostly children, they're routine inoculations. So it's ongoing. I think what's important to recognize, number one, is that the junta is weaponizing humanitarian aid. They are stopping the flow of humanitarian aid getting to where it needs to go. They are stopping convoys of food and medicine. They are imprisoning those who are driving and supporting these, and sometimes massacres of aid workers going into where this aid is needed. So they'll do everything possible to control that aid, stop it from going where they don't want it to go, which is almost always where it's most needed, and then control and manipulate the aid to where it wants to go in areas that it controls. I think cross-border aid, I think you put your finger right on it, Charles, it's very important, is going to be a critically important ingredient to this. There are INGOs who can be used as resources, CSOs operating in the country over the border. I think this is one perfect example where the NUG needs to be engaged in a meaningful way. They have information, they can provide guidance and support to those nations who want to provide that humanitarian aid. So it's a critical issue that gets worse with every passing day. And it's an area that we need to, number one, avoid the weaponization of this aid. And number two, get the aid where it needs to go by consulting the NUG, INGOs, CSOs to get it over the border. In terms of elections, I think you're again exactly right, Charles. We need to give voice to the fact that any suggestion that these elections could be legitimate is just preposterous. We need to make that very clear at the outset. And that anyone who engages in those elections in any capacity, listen, I've been a part of a number of election observation missions, serving as a resource to political parties campaigning and candidates and so forth and so on over the years. But the idea that an international entity or regional entity or nation would come in to provide technical assistance under these conditions is aiding and abetting an outrage, namely the so-called election. So it's very important that we call out those who may wittingly or unwittingly fall into that trap, and that we make sure, as you've suggested, that right at the outset, it's very clear that the conditions for a free and fair election do not exist in Myanmar. And we need to make sure that they're recognized for what they are, a farce and an illegitimate attempt to create a ruse of legitimacy by the junta.
Thank you. I indeed think that it's quite urgent now to start alerting this issue of fake elections. And as we know, authoritarian countries are very eager to invite fake observers. So we need to make sure that this is not happening. So I'd like to invite Mercy Barends now to take the floor. Please, Mercy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Tom, thank you very much for your sharing in the sessions. Back to your explanations before related with the UN function and positions and all the bodies in the UN. I just want to make sure how to make all the sanctions operate operate effectively, because we face the problem related with the veto holders. As we know that Myanmar have a strong relation with the China and Russia, and if the veto holders take position to ban the resolution, so what will happen next? do you have any suggestion or alternative suggestion to make all the sanction can be operate effectively? The second is related with the NUG positioning. As you know that NUG positioning now, sometimes, yeah, it's very, it's very dependable. It's depend on the what perspective we can see. What about the NUG on request for weaponry from abroad and its endorsements of certain acts of violence, including targeted killing against people seen as supporters on the junta? Because if both sides deliver a lot of atrocities and a lot of violence, it gives a detrimental impacts for the people in the field. The second, what do you think about the positioning NUG and the military junta? Do you think NUG should be formally recognized as the legitimate governments of Myanmar? If so, what steps could be taken toward this? And if not, what should Asian countries do, or international agency, international instruments body do related with these situations, especially how to make the military junta sit together and run the dialogue to get the best solution for the, I say, the stuck situation right now. Okay, this is for now. Thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. And now over to Tom.
Thank you, Mercy. Very, very, very good questions. Let me start with the NUG. I believe that they should be recognized. Certainly relative to the junta, they are the legitimate representatives of the people of Myanmar. They have taken very important steps forward to make sure that they have been and are inclusive, they are part of the solution to integrate and bring together the various communities in Myanmar into a coherent whole, including recognition of the citizenship rights of the Rohingya ethnic minority. Very, very important. That said, I think you have a very important point to make. Violations of human rights against anyone, by anyone, is still a violation of human rights. So those who are attacking individuals, they are engaging in violations of human rights. Extrajudicial killings, for example, are unacceptable and should be unacceptable to anyone and everyone. Now, to their credit, the NUG has established a set of guiding principles in which it is, they are very specifically laying out what those who are supporting them and working for a free Myanmar should be the principles and the behavior that they should be engaged in, but those have to be enforced. And they need to make a very clear, unambiguous statement that extrajudicial killings by anyone is unacceptable, period. And we will continue to monitor, and we will continue to identify those cases in which these killings have occurred. They're simply unacceptable. But what is important, it seems to me, is that we as an international community work with the NUG to whatever extent is possible, formal recognition or functional recognition, as I say, whatever is possible, they're an important asset and resource for the international community. In terms of coordinated action and how do we get there, the UN has guiding principles on business and human rights. So not only should nation states, governments, be examining the role that we are playing and could be playing to put pressure on Myanmar, the private sector also has to do this as well. And I think this is a very important ingredient to coordinated international action. So investors, brokerage firms, banks, other financial institutions, they need to examine their investments, and they need to terminate their investments in companies that are engaged in business operations that support the junta and that are fueling its atrocities against the people of Myanmar. Let me just quote the guiding principles here, a very relevant point. Where a business enterprise contributes or may contribute to adverse human rights impact, it should take the necessary steps to cease or prevent its contribution and use its leverage to mitigate any remaining impact to the greatest extent possible. So this is a responsibility of all of us as investors and for institutions that are engaged in the use and direction of these assets and resources. We also need to play a role in the private sector as well as in the public sector.
Thanks. Mercy, do you have other questions?
No, thank you, Heidi.
Okay, then perhaps thanks very much, Tom, for raising the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is has become a mainstream topic in the EU now, how to enforce them. And there's very interesting legislation coming up. And I would like to perhaps ask you a little bit about how, can you give us some examples of, let's say, foreign companies, how they have perhaps withdrawn from activities with the junta, or at least is there awareness among companies, and how to sort of raise the importance? We in the EU are trying to do that. There's an advisory by the European Commission in this sense to ask the European companies to show extraordinary due diligence vis-a-vis operating businesses in Myanmar. And we, of course, all recognize that Kirin, the brewery company from Japan, was the first, I believe, to state their reasons to why they needed to withdraw from any joint operation with Myanmar, with the junta. So perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on the sort of what you see in the business sector vis-a-vis the UN Guiding Principles.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, and may I just recommend the United Nations has a working group, a working committee that is examining the application of these guiding principles. It is an important resource to touch base with, both in terms of what are the available actions and who has been doing what. I've been engaged in a variety of discussions with various business entities who are examining their role and how they could be taking more responsible action when it comes to Myanmar. And I don't want to, there is a list of those companies. I've mentioned just a few of the enterprises that we want to target, and investment firms. Some governments are stepping up post-coup in ways that they hadn't before. And so the UN has information about how to do it and who is doing it. And I would recommend that you take a look at some of the comprehensive information that is available through the United Nations. Let me just say this: there are three key things, in my view, that the junta needs to continue its reign of terror. It needs money, it needs weapons, and it needs legitimacy. And I think anything that we can do to target any one of those entities is going to be extremely, extremely important. And I know that Chris Sidoti is going to be speaking to you later. I think he can fill in some of the specifics here, additional steps that can be taken in terms of the private sector. He was part of the fact-finding mission that was very comprehensive in its identification of these financial assets and resources. And I'll tell you, that was a document that I have been using, and I recommend it to you as well, to identify and track who and how the junta is being supported.
Thank you. Colleagues, do you have other questions to the Special Rapporteur?
Heidi?
Yes, Mercy, please.
Yeah, maybe can add some points related with the aid assistance related with the security issue for the aid assistance for the people at the border. What can be done to prevent Thailand from sending those who reach the border to be sent back to Myanmar? Because this is the human right issues at the border lines. The second is related with the security issue, especially for human rights defenders, for people at the borders. And because all the humanitarian aids come from international agency, they give to the military junta, and military junta distributes so many problems related with the situation of the what we call it humanitarian aids. And the third is related with the how to make the international agency, especially for the UN, to give the strong decision related with the humanitarian aid assistance, that the humanitarian activity is not the externalities for the people at the borders, but it is the essentiality for the people at the borders, especially for the IDPs of Myanmar. What do you think, Tom? Thank you.
Well, I think you've said it very clearly, Mercy, and very forcefully, and it's one of the great assets that you as a network of parliamentarians have. I think you need to give voice to this, as you are, in a coordinated way through APHR, but then also in your respective parliaments and in petitioning your respective governments about basic responsibilities that we all have to make sure that humanitarian aid gets to where it needs to go and does not get to where it should not be going. Your point about refugees is an extremely important one. Under no circumstance should anyone who has run for their lives to seek safety in a country, under no circumstances should they be sent back into Myanmar. They are refugees by definition. To go back to Myanmar, almost all of them would either be killed or they would be imprisoned and probably almost certainly tortured. So we have an obligation as a world, as nation states, to protect those people. And that is the very definition of refugee and the very obligation that we all have as members of this international community and as UN member states. I was in Malaysia last week, about 10 days ago, and I met with a number of people who had just taken extraordinary risk to make their way through Thailand. First, they had to get into Thailand, then through Thailand, and then into Malaysia. Not because they wanted to do it, leaving their home, taking a great risk, but because they had to do it. And it was a young woman who was just describing to me just the living hell that she went through. She started out with a group of 50 people, and a total of 3 people made it finally over the border into Malaysia. The huge risks that people take is not something that they do lightly. It's not something that because they just want to have a change of scenery in their lives. They're doing it because they have no choice. It's a life and death decision that they make. And I remember this young woman saying that, you leave your home and your community that you go through this perilous course that you don't know, and you're going to a future that you also don't know. But what you do know is that there is no alternative than to take that action if your life is at stake and if your family's life is at stake. And so I think it's really important for all of us, no matter where we are, to be reiterating and voicing that reality and the obligation that we as a people, as a world have to supporting and saving these refugees.
As a follow-up, one could of course ask, Is there independent monitoring, some sort of, let's say, a CSO intelligence or something about these pushbacks that Mercy asked about? What do we know? And is there a way to find out what actually is happening? Because indeed, as you said, the international community should under no circumstances accept that people are returned to the country like Myanmar from across the border. So how can we know more about what actually is happening? I've been talking to the Thai authorities here in the EU, and they are quite evasive on this issue. Should we know more about it?
Madam Chair, I think we should. They have, the authorities have denied that pushback is occurring. But they need to be engaged, and I think that those we have CSOs that have enormous information that are operating at or near the border, and INGOs that are operating at or near the border that can be important resources. So I think your question is very, very important. I think it's a question we should all be asking as individual states and as regions, and that we need to keep affirming that fundamental principle that under no condition should people be sent back to Myanmar.
Thank you, Tom. Now, I would like to ask my colleagues if there are any more issues that would need to be raised. And then,
I have one last question.
Yes,
thanks,
Charles,
thanks,
please go ahead.
Madam Chair. Tom, last week, there was a representative of an NGO who talked about the failure of the global justice system vis-a-vis Myanmar. And she basically said that every possible system that we have, the ICC, the United Nations, parliaments of the world, have just completely let down, have failed to address the Myanmar question. And therefore, she said, I have no hope that anything will change, that anything will come positive as a result of what's but from any of these organizations, whether it's the UN or whether it's the European Union or whether it is ASEAN and so on and so forth, or ICC itself. Any recommendations on how to salvage a broken down global justice system?
Charles, you always ask the easy questions. That is a huge, huge question. And I think that the frustration that the NGO leader who you just referred to, that frustration is fully justified. Obviously, there is much more that needs to be done. Now, the ICC, obviously, the Security Council is not going to could make reference to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. They're not going to do it. We know there's a proceeding that is ongoing right now by virtue of action taken by Bangladesh and the forced deportation of Rohingya into Bangladesh. We know that the International Court of Justice is examining the question of genocide that occurred in Myanmar. That is ongoing. The IIMM is conducting investigations right now and accumulating evidence that can be then used in a criminal proceeding. And that's extremely important. And then there are countries with universal jurisdiction laws on the books that are applying those laws. That is to say that the application of violations, fundamental violations that are occurring anywhere in the world, they can adjudicate those within their own countries and rule on these violations, these basic human rights violations. So those are the mechanisms that exist. They're in some state of play as we move forward. And I think we just need to keep keep the pressure on to utilize every one of those mechanisms to the greatest extent that we can. And in the meantime, do everything we can do within the scope of the possible, namely conjure up the political will to take the actions that we've all been describing.
Thank you.
So certainly we will look into this much more, what is going on and what the potential is. Now I have one more question, if you still have a few minutes. your report from February has identified Russia, China, and Serbia as main providers of weapons to the junta since the coup. Could you perhaps inform and update us a little bit about what you know about these weapon providers? Are there any new ways to block arms supplies from Russia, and what to do about China?
Thank you very much. And let me just say that we may have a little bit of, you may hear some background noise. My canine colleagues have just spotted somebody approaching the house, so they're going to be a whole.
Okay, I think we will make it. We'll manage with your dogs.
I apologize. We have some work being done in the yard, and I thought they would be showing up much later, so I apologize.
Well, they don't have a clock.
But in any case, yes, I mean, we identified categories of offenders, those sources of weapons in the report. And I want you to. The number one category, or the worst offenders that we identified, were those who had been providing or continue to provide weapons to the junta since the coup. And Russia, as you mentioned, China, as you mentioned, I've seen no change in their positioning as suppliers of weapons. Belarus was also mentioned in the report. Serbia was mentioned in the report, but what we have seen is that in the case of Serbia, they have made it clear that they will no longer authorize the transfer of weapons into Myanmar. So that's notable progress and an important step forward. And then they have the other categories of weapons and also dual-use technology, which is also extremely important to identify and focus on that technology, which can be used both for weapons and have domestic uses, but are very dangerous nonetheless. What we did in that report was identify and target those countries that were providing those weapons that specifically can be used to attack civilians. And that was our mission. And so what you see in the escalation of violence, particularly in the northwest of Myanmar, is the use of fighter jets, attack helicopters, heavy artillery, shelling these villages, and then another technique they're using is torching the villages. Let me give one example of I talked to a dad whose village had been torched, and he brought his family into an IDP camp for safety. 2 days before I spoke with him, and it took great courage for him to go to a place where he could risk speaking with me on a video phone. And he explained to me that 2 days before, his only daughters, 2 daughters, ages 12 and 15, died in their sleep when an artillery barrage hit the IDP center, and shrapnel killed his only 2 children, his two daughters. So we talk about statistics, and they're horrible. We talk about the escalation of the use of these weapons to kill people. It's horrible, but these are real human beings, real families that are being massacred by these atrocities. So anything and everything that we can do, including and by the way, Madam Chair, I'm going to continue to update in my ongoing reports to both the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly information that I learned about these weapons and weapons proliferation. And may I also say that we're planning now to dig in a little deeper to identify the private sector support for these weapons and weapons technology. Who are the investors that are investing in these weapons? Who are the middlemen, as it were, that are facilitating the transfer of these weapons? Who are the companies that are profiting from the sale of these weapons? So we focused in February on the role that states are playing And now we're going to focus on the role that the individual investors and companies are playing. So that's a report that will be forthcoming from my office.
Thank you. We will certainly pay close attention to that report. So I think we have now come to the end of our questions, and thank you very much, Tom, for the great work you're doing. And you have provided us with extremely valuable suggestions on how to evoke the international action to stop this terrible atrocity against the people of Myanmar. So we look forward to talking to you, and as you mentioned, you continue to report to international bodies, and please keep us also informed if there's anything that we should use in our forthcoming report. So
well,
thank you.
Chair. Thank you so much. I will do that. And listen, thank you for this important work that you're doing. I can't tell you how important it is to expose this to the full light of day. So for the work you're doing here, and then all the work you do as APHR, thank you so very, very much. And I look forward to working closely with you in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks,
That's
Tom.
a great
Thank you,
commitment.
Tom.